welcome everyone who's joining us, and delighted that you could be here, delighted to be joined by Tim Harford. He is an author of the brand new book, The Data Detective, which is going to be mostly, I think, what we talk about today, but he's written a bunch of other books. The Undercover Economist does, I guess it's a show for the BBC called More or Less, and has been sort of helping us figure out what's true and what's not in the world of statistics now for some time. And so I'm just delighted that you could be here to join us.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be asked to join in, and yeah, happy to have the fireside chat. I feel we all need that warmth.
Look.
Yeah, it's been a long winter. It's really been a very long year. So
yes,
the fire
people
is
always
great.
ask me, do I have an actual fireside? And I actually do have an actual fireside, which is great. So I want to start with the bold claim that was made in the 50s in a book by what's his name, Darrell Huff, called How to Lie with Statistics. And you open your book with that sort of snarky, dismissive view. And your book really is a passionate riposte to his argument that, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And you take your readers through a series of rules, 10 rules, as the book title says, for how to become a smarter consumer, if you will, of statistics, and in defense of what statistics can do for us. So I thought perhaps just start off with why this book, why now, and how you think, what's the impact you hope it'll have in the world.
Well, I've been presenting this program, which you mentioned, more or less, on the BBC for about 15 years, and we do fact checking, and we talk about numbers, and a politician says a thing, and we pop up and say that wasn't actually true, and that's all fine. And then 2016 happened, and of course in 2016 the appetizer for my fellow Brits was the Brexit referendum, and the main course was the election of, well, you know who. And in both cases, wherever you stand politically, I think you've got to admit that people didn't seem to be very interested in the truth. Nobody seemed to care anymore. And I realized so much of what people think is governed by their politics. It's governed by their emotion. It's governed by what their friends think. It's not necessarily governed by the evidence. So in that case, what exactly am I doing, and what are my colleagues doing, presenting a program about the numbers? So that was one thing that really struck me, that if I'm going to write a book helping people think clearly about numbers, I really need to write a book that just helps people think clearly, full stop. And that's the starting point. If you can't get control of those biases, you haven't got a hope. The other thing was just the thing that people would always say to me, which was, oh, we really love your radio program. We love the way you smack down those dodgy statistics. We love the way you show the way that statistics are always used to mislead us. And I thought, well, it's nice that you like the program, but statistics aren't always used to mislead us. They are, in fact, we haven't got a hope of understanding the world without statistics. And so that's why I felt it needed defending. And that's why I started with Darrell Huff, with this incredibly popular book, How to Lie with Statistics. Because I thought it is a good book, but that's not the main story we should be telling about statistics.
Yeah. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And early on in the book, which I gather was finished last April, so we were into COVID-19, and you contrast two cases, I guess I would say, at least that's how I read it. The first is the discovery that smoking and cancer are related, and a statistical tour de force that had every political, social, and economic force at the time basically arrayed against it. And then contrast with this approach to COVID-19, when we were flying blind. We had nothing to go on. And I think it's very interesting to take those two actionable ideas and contrast them. So, you make the point in the early in the story about cigarette smoking, which I thought was fascinating. And for a lot of our listeners who don't know this conclusion that smoking and cancer were related was a multi-decade project. I mean, it was very hard for researchers to demonstrate this. And of course, the tobacco companies and those that benefited from smoking and those that just enjoyed it were not particularly thrilled about this. But one of the stories you tell is of a statistician in that book collecting data about doctors who smoke. And I love his comment. He says, whether you die of cancer or whether you die of something else, I don't really care. I shall score up your death anyway.
Yeah. And he was Austin Bradford Hill, who, by the way, was originally trained as an economist, which I think is probably where he learned his charm. People didn't like it, but this is the important thing. People didn't like it. Doctors, 85% of male doctors, and most doctors were men at the time, 85% of them smoked. And so Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, these two epidemiologists, they're trying to get data on smoking from doctors. Like how many do you smoke? And they were clever because they realized doctors don't disappear. They're all on the medical register. And when a doctor dies, you're going to get a good cause of death because another doctor is going to come and give the cause of death. So you're going to get really good information. So they tried to gather all this data on smoking from doctors, but they got pushback. And the reason they got pushback is because people felt threatened by the idea that smoking was dangerous. Because of course, if smoking is killing you and you smoke, and most people did, it's hard to quit. You really don't want to think that that's true. And that's the thing that Bradford Hill was pushing back at. He was buttonholed at a dinner party and accused of being anti-smoking and trying to get everyone to quit. But it's what the tobacco companies really latched onto was the fact they didn't need to prove that cigarettes were safe. People wanted to believe they were safe. So all you needed to do was give people some reason to believe they were safe, some reason to doubt this growing mountain of evidence. And we've seen that really ever since. You don't need to prove your case. You just need to poke a few holes or give people a nagging sense of doubt in what the other side is saying, and that's enough.
Yeah, and one of my favorite lines from the book is, doubt is an easy product to make. Yeah,
it really is. And the cigarette companies, they're on the record as having said their product was doubt. And this was the marketing department. Doubt is our product. There's a great book called Doubt is Their Product, in fact, about the history of this. But we've seen it over. I mean, my book begins with this story about cigarettes, but it's not a book about cigarettes. It's a book about thinking about the world. But we've seen it over and over again. So I saw it in the Brexit referendum. You see it in politics. You see it in the discussion on climate change. Just poke a little bit of doubt. Just plant that seed in someone's mind that maybe the expert they're listening to maybe doesn't know what they're talking about, and then wishful thinking will do the rest. So, I mean, just to give you an example that's bang up to date, there's been a lot of controversy recently about all the people who said that there wouldn't be a second wave of COVID, and then there was a second wave of COVID, and in the UK, the second wave's been worse than the first wave, and some of these people have then defended themselves by going on the attack. They've said, oh, well, the WHO got it wrong. Okay, well, I mean, we all make mistakes. What exactly did the WHO get wrong? And they say, well, WHO said that the infection fatality rate was 3.5%, back in March. And I went and I had a look. The WHO never said that. They said that the case fatality rate was 3.5%, but I don't want to get all sort of technical, but the case fatality rate is something totally different. But the point is, what's the method? I'm under attack. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find some spurious line of attack against an expert and say, look, that expert got it wrong, and therefore you can't criticize me. And you just see it over and over again.
We see it everywhere.
It's not helping us think clearly.
In our public sphere, we see it everywhere. So in the US, there's a lot of discussion of whataboutism. So you point out an action or a practice that has adverse effects, and then the first thing people say is, well, yeah, of course that does, but what about this other completely unrelated thing that also had adverse effects? And I think it's a very hard thing to combat. There was just a piece in the New York Times, in fact, last week, with a gentleman who coined I don't know if he coined the phrase, but he certainly capitalized on the phrase, the attention economy. And he said one of the hardest things to combat in an attention economy is the fact that our attention, gets diverted by these shiny objects, outrageous statements, worthy sort of causes. And that's news. And reality is often not news. So in the book, you talk about a headline that will never be written. News, 154,000 people escaped from poverty yesterday, which is, right?
Yeah.
But
true, but not
like
news.
That headline. Sorry?
True, but not news. Yeah.
Exactly. And I do think, I just think this is such an important topic in that, ordinary people are now, and I think part of the easy access to networks, to information, everybody's their own reporter, everybody's their own editor, everybody can conclude what they want to conclude. And I think one of the reasons your book has just so taken me is it offers a path forward, I think.
Well, thank you. But we're getting into this idea of really sort of emotional command now. When we haven't talked about correlation and causation. We haven't talked about spreadsheets. We haven't talked about R squared or P hacking or any of that stuff. We're really talking about trying to find a little bit of wisdom while communicating statistical information and while communicating the headlines in general. So rule number one in the book is notice your emotions.
Yeah.
Trust, and it's not a case of trust your feelings. It's a case of notice your feelings. If you're having an emotional reaction to something that you see, you feel afraid, you feel denial. It can't be true. It's fake news. You feel vindication. Or this just proves that I was right and they're wrong. Whatever the emotional reaction is, you're not thinking clearly. And it's perfectly appropriate to have an emotional reaction. And we're human beings. But I really think you need to count to 3, notice that you've had it, and then go back and have another look at the claim. And then a later rule in the book, I forget whether it's rule 3 or 4, but is to step back and take in the view. And that really gets to the point of what you were saying about distraction and this idea of the news really varying. What's the news for 5 minutes or for an hour may be very different to what the news is once you step back and you read the weekend newspaper or a monthly newspaper, or you look at last year's news or the news from 10 years ago. So this constant distraction, sort of fast click attention to stuff that's actually trivial. Really, really hard to think clearly if you're constantly being distracted by whatever is new.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think also the motivations of many people are not to get to what is true. They're well served by getting to what is not true. So one of our questions is, broadly, how do we combat this? And I think what I'd like to do, Leif and Frank and Bogdan, is just go through the chapters in the book, because I think each of them has a little nugget of real wisdom that we can actually use, this afternoon if we're so motivated. So the first one is search your feelings, and you've already talked about, notice how you feel. How does this piece of news or this bit of information make you feel? But then the next one I thought was interesting was ponder your personal experience, in that you have a statistic that says something, but every time you've ever encountered that thing, it's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying reject your personal experience in favor of what the data tell you, and I'm not saying reject the data in favor of what your personal experience tells you. The challenge is to try to combine the two. That's where the wisdom comes from. So I begin the chapter with just an example personally. I noticed that when I looked at the data on public transportation in London, it says that the underground trains aren't that busy, and it says that the buses aren't that busy. Yet I don't live in London anymore, but I used to. And whenever I got on a bus, it was packed. And then I get on a train, and it was you had to wait 3 or 4 trains to pass before you could even squeeze yourself onto a train. Now, this is going to sound very familiar to New Yorkers. And yet I looked at the data, and the data says, occupancy is like 10% maybe. How can it be 10%? And then what I realized was, it's partly that I'm traveling at rush hour. But here's the real thing. You could imagine 10 trains an hour. There are 1,000 people on the first train, and then there's nobody on any of the other trains. Well, then the average occupancy of the trains is 100. And that's really true. And if you want to understand how how efficiently the transport system is being used, that's a useful piece of information. But it's also true that every single person who uses the transport system thinks it's crowded, and they're right, because every time they're on a train, it's crowded. So there's this kind of systematic bias is not the word we should use really, but we've all got our own perspective, and the very fact that we're in the train is helping to make it more crowded. And the world is full of puzzles like that you really need to think hard about before you leap to conclusions.
Yeah, and one of the things I've studied off and on over the years is the unintended consequences. And when you're trying to figure out who's at fault in a situation, right? So let's say somebody runs a stop sign and runs into someone else. Well, if they'd run that stop sign and the other person wasn't there at all, there would have been no unintended consequence. So it's very interesting to sort of what is the actual causality going on. So another point that you make is to avoid premature enumeration, which, to me, it's like understanding what's the context, what are we counting, right?
Yeah.
And use the example there of Oxfam and the wealth studies.
Yeah. So premature enumeration is basically the problem of immediately diving into the spreadsheets and calculating, adding, subtracting, multiplying, running cross correlations without really asking yourself what it is that you're measuring or what's being measured. And it's very, very common. I'll listen to the radio, I'll see a newspaper headline, and my wife will say, well, is it true? Because I've been doing this for a while, so my wife thinks I've just got this huge list of every possible fact in my head. And the answer is normally, I don't know if it's true. And not only do I not know if it's true, I don't even know what they mean when they say that. Because I don't know when they're counting whatever it is, immigrants, they're counting crimes, they're counting gun deaths.
Infant mortality, you talk about.
Yeah, infant mortality. I mean, this is really amazing and sad story about trying to investigate causes of infant mortality in the UK, and it turns out it's a disagreement over, not even a disagreement, but there's changing custom over what it even means to be an infant. Like, at what point do you say that was a miscarriage, and at what point do you say that was a very premature birth? And of course, that's a really important decision to make, but some medical professional somewhere makes the decision, ticks a box that reflects this tragic event, and it goes into the statistics. And the British press at that point were getting very, very upset at a rise in infant mortality that it turns out wasn't actually a rise in infant mortality. It was just an uptick in the data. So you always need to ask yourself, what is it that's being measured? And that's partly so you understand what's going on, but I think it's also partly because we owe it to the people whose lives are being reflected, or whose deaths are being reflected in these numbers. We should be paying attention, showing sufficient interest and sufficient curiosity in what's actually behind each of those statistics.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so critical. And again, the thing that makes a headline is not necessarily the truth, and that is a disturbing thing. So then you have a practice of step back and enjoy the view. And
yes.
I think that's hard, when you're doom scrolling, how do you get away from that?
Yeah, well, there's really two elements to that, isn't there? There's partly the, I suppose you might call it the mindful news consumption, or the digital minimalism, or whatever you want to call it. A bit less Twitter, a bit less Facebook, pick up the New Yorker or the Economist, or, obviously I'm slightly biased, pick up the Financial Times Weekend, where I write every Saturday. Pick up a slightly slower news source, and you'll find it's less stressful to read, but you'll also find very often you're learning more, because, I mean, the tweets from 30 minutes ago are often they don't mean anything anymore. Mm-hmm. So you'll be calmer, but also just the idea that the perspective changes, what actually counts as news changes the further you pull back. So there's a wonderful idea. It's not my idea. It's from the economist Max Rosa, and he was inspired by some sociologists. The wonderful idea of the 100-year newspaper. Just thinking, what would a newspaper say if it hadn't been published since 1921? What would be noted in that newspaper, and what would count as a story? and what would not.
Mhm.
And one of the things you notice is that the further you step back, the more you get good news stories. And Steven Pinker has tried to reflect on why this might be. And I think it's because it's not that the media are biased towards bad news. It's just that the media are biased towards whatever's happened since the last publication, and bad things happen more quickly than good things. So amazingly good things can happen, but they usually take time, whereas bad things can happen in the blink of an eye. And so that's why the media tend to report in such a gloomy way. And you can see every now and then, think back to 9/11. That was a week where actually you could still have said at the end of the week, more people died this week of cigarette-related diseases than died in the terrorist attacks. But of course, no newspaper said that because they were interested in what was dramatic and sudden. So they're not always focused on what is the worst possible thing you could say, but they are interested in what's new. And the shorter your time horizon, the more likely it is that what's new is kind of grim and unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what's also fascinating to me is the half-life of our interest in a story. The thing that we were completely fascinated by in November, let's say, by now we can barely even remember what that was.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is fascinating. I think it might have been Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, who said to cure yourself for reading newspapers, just spend a year reading year-old newspapers. And I'm slightly biased. I write for a newspaper, but there's truth in that. You pick up old news and you realize some of it is really interesting, but a lot of it is just, oh yeah, why did we ever think that mattered?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and I do think it does relate to a bit to my world in academia, right? Which is that in the moment, it's very hard to figure out what some piece of evidence means. And so what the news does is it sort of throws it out. But there's this digestion period that you need to have to figure out, does this actually have meaning or not? Which brings me to the next chapter of the book, which is get the backstory.
Yeah. That is the stuff about academia. Yes.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And the core question of that chapter being, is this true?
Yeah. So I begin that chapter by talking about jam. There's a very famous experiment run exploring what happens when you give people more choice. And it was run by two very respected psychologists, and they used an upmarket supermarket, and they gave people a choice of jam. You taste some jam and then you get a voucher. You can buy more jam if you like. And some days they showed up with this huge array of jam. I think there were 24 different types of jam. And at other times it was much more tastefully minimal. There were just 6 types of jam on offer. And what they found was people bought a lot more jam when there were only 6 choices rather than 24 choices. Now, this is a really spectacular kind of result. It was really hit the sweet spot because it was kind of surprising, easy to explain. And at the same time, when people heard it, they were like, oh, yeah, actually, now I hear that, I think that's been true all along. So there were TED Talks, there were books. The tricky thing is, I was sort of musing about this and going, it's a bit weird, though, that when you go into a supermarket, there are so many choices available. Why haven't the supermarkets got the message? And I spoke about it to a professor of marketing. He said, you should talk to Benjamin Scheiberhenner. So I found Benjamin Scheiberhenner. Benjamin Scheiberhenner is a young psychology researcher, and he had been trying to explore this finding. And every time he ran one of these experiments, he found he just couldn't get the same results. He'd offer people more choice, and they were like, thanks, more choice, that's great. And he started asking around, and he found a lot of other psychologists had been doing similar things. Now, just to emphasize, there's nothing wrong with the original experiment. They're very respected researchers, and I'm sure they found what they found. But a lot of other psychologists did lots of other work, and there was this big sort of spread. And in the end, I think the conclusion of all of the work is probably doesn't make a lot of difference. You give people more choice, less choice, it doesn't make much difference to how much they buy. And there are outliers on either side. But it was the outlier that found this very surprising result, that you radically cut back the choice and people buy, it was like 10 times more jam. It's a lot of extra jam that people bought. That outlier was the one that got all the attention, got all the headlines. And that was the moment where I thought, I really need to ask myself, every time I see a result, this is the result that's being called to my attention because this is the result that's really interesting. But what are all the other results that are out there that have been conducted with equal rigor that I haven't seen because NPR aren't interested and TED aren't interested? And to be honest, often even the professional journals, they're not interested either. That's what I mean by the backstory.
That's fascinating. You know, we see this a lot in business, and this is another point you make in the book, which is a lot of what we believe to be true in business is deeply, deeply infected with survivor bias.
Yeah.
You know, the only ones we can study are the ones that we can see, right? We don't see all the ones that went before. And it reminds me a bit of the old story from World War II about where should we reinforce airplanes? And I'm sure you're familiar with this one. So these airplanes would come back and the wings would be riddled with bullet holes. And of course, the first and wrong conclusion is that you should reinforce those areas because that's where all these bullet holes were and everything. And then finally, one person turned around and said, well, hang on, those are the ones that came back. Yes. Let's reinforce, the other areas because that clearly meant that those planes could not come back. And I thought that was just a beautiful example of the mistakes we can make with survivor bias.
Absolutely, because we think to ourselves, I've never seen a plane that's taken a hit to the engine, so we don't need to reinforce the engine. And then if you think a bit more deeply, you go, I've never seen a plane that's taken a hit to the engine and made it home. That's what we should be thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just an interesting note on that, though. Mm-hmm. So that the mathematician was Abraham Wald, a great sort of statistician. But when I looked into this story, it turns out that story is a kind of it itself is an example of survivor bias, because the story, as far as I can work out, is true. But it's also been beautifully honed over the years to be this very memorable thing. I mean, you told me the story. I tell the story myself. I love the story. When I went back and looked at Abraham Wald's original paper, it's just full of maths, and there's no kind of amazing aha moment where he points this thing out about the engines. It's just like the mathematicians, I think the paper is very beautiful, but nobody remembers like all the maths. Mm-hmm. Nobody remembers all the analysis he did. Mm-hmm. What they remember was this little bit of insight that was buried in it. And that's the thing that got published, or not even published. That's the thing that got remembered over and repeated over and over again. Right. And that's true really all around us. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean it's not true. It's perfectly true, and it's a very important insight. Mm-hmm. But we do need to remember that everything we see has basically been systematically filtered for interestingness. And interestingness is quite a powerful filter.
I love that comment. We often talk about what's interesting, at least in my world, in terms of challenges to weakly held assumptions. So the weakly held assumption is where all the bullet holes are, is where you should reinforce. But isn't it interesting that maybe that's wrong? And I also think the power of story, and this is something we work on a lot in courses on communication and how you persuade people, and people gravitate towards the stories. And I think we have this myth in business that we look at PowerPoints and we're very analytical and blah, 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 but it's the story, that captures people every time. And I think that's where sometimes we get taken by surprise by how things catch on, that when you look at them, it's like, how could anybody believe that?
Yeah.
And yet they're taken in by the story.
No, absolutely. And I'm a complete hypocrite, because here I am saying, take the numbers seriously, pay attention to the numbers, don't get carried away by your emotions. But I love telling stories, and the book is full of stories.
Oh, it is. It is.
And my only defense is I do think all the stories are true and insightful, but
well, no less a luminary than Malcolm Gladwell says, you're a genius at telling stories that illuminate our world.
He's a very wise man, Malcolm. Very wise man.
He's a smart guy, isn't he?
He is. And these stories, the stories that he tells, it's harder than he makes it look.
Oh, yeah. He's a genius himself. So your sixth rule is ask who's missing.
Yeah. So this is really important from a statistical point of view, but I think more from just the point of view of understanding the societies that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
There was a fantastic book published in the UK. I mean, it's published in the US, but I don't think it got the attention it deserved. It was a huge bestseller in the UK called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. And the point that Caroline made is that systematically we design data sets that are either built around a default assumption of a man will be filling in this questionnaire. So it'll be built around, for example, the assumption of a full-time job, which is not an assumption that applies if you're, say, asking households in Uganda, about their economic prospects. The men have full-time jobs, the women are working 90-hour weeks, but they wouldn't claim to have full-time jobs. So Caroline Criado Perez sort of made this observation that we design the data very often without really considering the needs of people other than white men. Mm-hmm. Or we don't make distinctions between men and women when we should. That proved to be really important in the early days of COVID, because it turns out COVID is more dangerous for men. Good data on that now, but most of the worst hit countries, including the UK and the US, didn't disaggregate their death statistics by gender. So, there was no way to figure it out. And the other point that Caroline makes, I think, that's really important at times is sometimes we're doing clinical trials and women are excluded from the clinical trials because, the one thing you know about men is they're never pregnant. So let's just get men. It's just simpler. And one of the stories I tell in the book is the trial for sildenafil. So sildenafil, it's all male trial. Sildenafil is an angina drug. It's supposed to be treating angina. It doesn't really work for angina, but turns out gives these guys magnificent erections. And so I think it was Pfizer made the drug. They're like, oh, okay, great. Let's call it Viagra. And the rest is history. Except it turns out that a few years ago, some small trials started to find that maybe it's a really good treatment for period pain, for menstrual cramps. But you can't discover that by accident if all of the people in your trial are male. And if all the people in the trial had been female, we might have discovered this amazing treatment for period pain and never discovered the treatment for erectile dysfunction. So it's, it matters. It matters who's, and of course, I've talked about gender, but ethnicity, or simply an opinion poll where the Republicans don't want to talk to the pollsters and the Democrats do. I mean, these issues come up in all kinds of different ways, and you've always got to ask yourself, who am I missing? Mm-hmm. You may not be able to get to reach them. You may not be able to get in touch with them, but you need to try.
I think it's fascinating. And when you talk about polling, right, certainly the last election we had in the US, there was, rather a lot of red faces going on because the pollsters, again, got it wrong. And there was a rather snarky conservative commentator who said, well, that's because people have learned, that it's not in their own best interest to answer these things truthfully. So you always have to look at what the interest is, right?
It's a hard problem. The polling is a hard problem, and pollsters know it's a hard problem, but they, just because it's hard doesn't mean you can fix it. So, and the way I put it, after the last election, the FT asked me to write a piece just explaining why did the polls miss? And obviously, the polls predicted Biden would win and Biden won, okay, but they were systematically off again. Mm-hmm. Actually, they were off in about the same places and by about the same margin as they were in 2016. It's just Biden's lead was larger, so it didn't change the result. But one of the things I said is you've got to understand, with an opinion poll, you're getting in touch with 50,000 people, and maybe 48,000 of them tell you to go away or never pick up the phone, or just don't respond. And so the last 1,000 or 2,000, you're interpreting what they tell you, and then you have to say, well, are these people basically the same as the 48,000 people who wouldn't talk to me?
Right.
Or is there something systematically different about those people? And if there is something systematically different, what is it? And of course, in the what is it, that's where all the adjustments and all the guesswork goes. And it's hard. I mean, it's amazing that they're actually not far off, but maybe we expect more than we have any right to expect. from opinion
Well, I
polls.
think we get lulled into this sense of precision, when they say, oh, statistically within this or that percent, there's a tendency for people to say, oh, well, it must be very accurate if they can talk about percentages, right?
Yeah.
So then you
absolutely.
talk about demanding transparency when the computer says no.
Yes. So algorithms. The thing that really excited me, there's loads to say about algorithms. There's Google flu trends and there's all kinds of stuff. But the thing that really struck me is a monk in the 1600s, I think, really told us what we needed to know about algorithms. And that was the realization, one of the big realizations of the whole book for me. So in the 1650s, you had this moment where alchemy and chemistry existed at the same time. And alchemy was basically, you're trying to find the elixir of life and turn lead into gold. Spoiler, they did not find the elixir of life and they have not managed to turn lead into gold. Alchemy didn't go anywhere. It didn't even produce informative failures. And it wasn't even that everyone went, oh, it turns out you can't turn lead into gold. That's interesting. But at the same time, chemistry is going great guns. It's doing really well. So why? So one explanation is, well, scientists experimented and alchemists didn't. That's nonsense, because alchemists loved experimenting. So another possible explanation is, well, the scientists were just smarter people than the alchemists, people like Isaac Newton or Robert Hooke. But it turns out that Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke were also really into alchemy. So that doesn't work as an explanation. You've got the same people using the same methods and getting nowhere. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is science had norms of sharing data, performing experiments very transparently, being very open about the results and debating and criticizing them and repeating them. And these norms were most promoted by this monk, Marin Mersenne, who was sometimes called the post office of Europe or the post box of Europe, because all these different scientists would communicate by sending letters to him, and he would just copy and forward the letters on. And so Mersenne was all about transparency, discussion, collaboration, constructive criticism. Meanwhile, alchemy is, remember, the same people, the same methods, but it's all a secret. And it's a secret because if you can turn lead into gold, you certainly don't want anybody else knowing how you did it. And in fact, when Hooke was going to speak out about some of his experiments, Newton said, no, maintain high silence, don't tell anybody. And that's why they made no progress. And there was just, and part of the problem was they all assumed that other alchemists were making progress or that previous alchemists had made progress, but nobody knew. And so the field never advanced. Okay, so what's that got to do with algorithms? Right, well, modern algorithms, obviously much more powerful and much more potentially productive than alchemy, but you've still got, in many cases, the same norms of secrecy. We're not going to give you our data. We're not going to tell you how the algorithm works. And why? Because we want to make money. And that, I think, is what we really have to change, especially when algorithms are being used by the government to make life or death decisions about us. So algorithms, for example, which are assigning who gets put onto a call for child protection because we're afraid that a child is in danger, or algorithms which decide who gets bail and who has to go to jail while awaiting their trial. And these are really important decisions. We're handing them over to algorithms. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think it's quite plausible that the algorithm could make at least as good a decision, maybe a better decision than humans, because humans are biased and fallible. We've got no transparency, we've got no idea what's going on. And when the algorithms go wrong, we've got no way to know it.
And no redress. Yeah. I think that is a huge topic. Maybe we'll come back and have a conversation just on that one. But then you talk about statistical bedrock. Don't take it for granted.
Yes, this is where I really nerd out. Although at least I begin the chapter with a story about a congressman and a stripper, which I won't repeat because there isn't time. But it's a good story. But that particular escapade leads to the book,
everybody. Buy the book.
Yeah. It's all in here. It's actually an amazing story. But that has the side effect of shaking up the US statistical apparatus and leading to the setting up of the Congressional Budget Office and the amazing Alice Rivlin being put in charge of the Congressional Budget Office. But the point I make in that chapter is that we really shouldn't be taking official statistics for granted. And I list all of the examples of prominent politicians around the world going to great lengths to smear or to threaten, sometimes even imprison or threaten with death, statisticians. Well, of course, with Joe Stalin, he did just murder them. But in other cases, it's prosecuted for treason. They lose their job, that kind of thing. And the incredible work that statisticians are doing to basically provide the information that all of us need to understand what's going on in the world, to base our private businesses on, because a lot of private data businesses have this bedrock of official statistics, to hold governments to account. It's incredibly important. And for me, statistics are like radar or an MRI scan for someone who's sick. And they are telling us what is going on all around us. They're showing us things we wouldn't be able to see in any other way. And we absolutely should not be taking them for granted and treating them as though they're just some weapon in a political campaign. And that's what that chapter is all about.
Yeah, and I think, there are many, many lessons about COVID, about Brexit, about, things to be taken from that. So just on that, I'm going to jump us ahead a little bit, because I was very taken with the last, we got through 10 rules, and the remaining rules, just so we didn't get to them, is misinformation can be beautiful too, and keep an open mind. But you finish with the golden rule of being curious. And one of the things that really caught my attention is your discussion of how can you persuade someone who is, absolutely committed to their point of view. How do you begin to at least have a reasonable conversation and potentially reduce that polarization in their minds?
Yes. Well, the first thing I should say is the aim of my book is to really help you get your own thinking straight. And if you can get anybody else's thinking straight, then that's a bonus. Just always start with yourself, okay?
At least you can manage that, right?
Well, it's not as easy as it
really isn't. It really
isn't.
I tried myself with some of the recommendations you have, and I'm like, oh, geez, I didn't say that, and it's all too easy to sort of do a 140 character thing, and then look afterwards you go, well, why did I say that?
No, I break my own rules every day, although I try not to, but I think I break them less often than before I wrote the book. But yeah, so one thing I think it's really important to understand is that you can have a much better conversation with someone if you invite them to explain themselves, and in particular to explain what they believe about the world, what they understand about the world, rather than pressing them to defend their view. So I was very struck by this wonderful thing called the illusion of explanatory depth. So the classic illusion of explanatory depth study says, you ask people, how well do you think you understand how a flush lavatory works? Or how well do you think you understand how a bicycle works? And people will rate that on 1 to 10 and say, I think I'm a 9 out of 10 on the lavatory. And then the researchers say, oh, that's great. Here's a pen, here's paper. Could you just draw me a diagram, explain exactly how it works, bullet points, just use as much detail as you feel able. At which point people go, actually, I don't like, why does in the lavatory, why does the water, like, why does it disappear? And and it kind of go, and then it's clean and then it kind of fills, but doesn't, why does any of that happen? I don't know. Where does the chain go on a bicycle? They realize they don't know. And to their credit, at that point, they then will row back and go, actually, I'm not a 9 out of 10, I'm like a 5 out of 10. I don't really know as much as I did. They've done the same research for political questions. So unilateral sanctions on Iran, cap and trade, whatever, the trade war with China, what are the tariffs on China? How does the Affordable Care Act work? And you get the same thing. So people are like, I can explain the details of that. And then when you invite them to do that, they realize they can't, and then they row back. But when you do it with political issues, what you find is people also move away from political extremes. They see things in more kind of shades of gray rather than black and white. they start to think less unfavorably of their political opponents. I mean, generally, you realize I was willing to go to the barricades to defend this policy, and I realize I can't even explain what the policy is. So now I feel a bit stupid. So what all this suggests to me is when you're having a heated political argument with someone, just take a step back and say, okay, you're in favor of the border wall. Just explain to me how you think it's going to work. Like, what's the plan, and how is it different from what went before? And just explain to me that. Don't tell me why it's a great idea. Just explain to me what was proposed. Mm-hmm. And at that point, very often, people will realize, oh, I didn't really know much about it, actually. And then they start to moderate their views. But the alternative is they know a load about it, and you've asked them to explain it, and they'll explain it to you, and then you'll be smarter. So either they'll get smarter or you'll get smarter. But either way, at least you stop shouting at each other. And it really connects to this idea that curiosity about the world is what's driving all of this. And that's why I call it the golden rule. Are we seeing statistics as a sort of weapon to win an argument? Mm-hmm. Or are we seeing them as a tool through which we can see the world more clearly? And the moment you see them as a way of perceiving the world, a window onto the world, and the moment you're asking yourself, is this making me any smarter? Am I understanding anything better? I want to know more. You're in a much better position to use them in a clear way, because you've stopped trying to prove someone else wrong. And that itself is going to make you wiser, I think.
And do you think this could begin to blunt a bit the divisiveness, the politicization of ordinary, what I think of sometimes purely ordinary things, all of a sudden get this attribution of being a political statement or a point or one thing or another?
I mean, it is incredible what gets politicized. I mean, we've seen COVID has been politicized. Running shoes have been politicized. Now, Nike is a progressive running shoe now. And, I understand why they've done that. I completely understand it. Mm-hmm. But part of me goes, now, like, you can't show up at the gym without people knowing whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And maybe that's not great, even if it's, other parts of what they've done are good. I worry about that.
Yeah.
I talk in the conclusion to the book about the politicization of vaccines. This is really interesting work from Dan Kahan's group at Yale. So it turns out you've got the HBV vaccine, hepatitis B, and you've got the HPV vaccine, which is the human papillomavirus. And they're quite similar vaccines, but one of them is not politicized at all. You get the vaccine if your doctor tells you to get the vaccine. And the other vaccine is, you get the vaccine if your congressional representative tells you to get the vaccine. It's completely politicized along party lines. Huh. And so how did that happen? And how did that decision that should be a medical decision, how did it get dragged into the political realm, and can we drag it back out again? And the answer is it's not easy to drag it back out once it's become politicized. Mm-hmm. But these sort of questions of, asking questions, being curious, being open-minded, that sort of approach, I think, is really the only chance we've got to try to drag ourselves back from this crazy situation where everything is politicized.
Yeah. And we're in self-referential worlds of our own creation. I mean, I think that's one of the unfortunate consequences of this information splinterization that we got. It's entirely possible to spend an entire week with people who have no different opinion than you do, no matter how crazy that opinion is, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think two elements of our current information system are, as you mentioned earlier, distraction. We're constantly distracted. We're not necessarily paying attention to what really matters or going deep. And polarization. So we're being very, very influenced by what people around us think, what people on our side think, and people on the other side are wrong. But what do you get if you take distraction, so not really paying attention to what's important, paying attention to trivial things, plus polarization, put the two together and add steroids? What have you got? Conspiracy thinking.
Yeah.
Because conspiracy thinking is basically paying attention to bizarre little coincidences or non-existent clues somewhere in the information space, Not paying attention to evidence at all. Why would you not pay attention to evidence? Because you regard everything, all actual facts as being manufactured by the conspiracy.
Right.
And you're paying only to what other believers in the conspiracy believe. So I see it as just, it's not different from what all of us, the pressures that we're all under, it's just more extreme. And you see, if you really concentrate it and push it, that's where you end up.
Absolutely. And of course, any evidence that there's a crack in a conspiracy theory gets met with the counter response. Well, of course it is. That's a deeper conspiracy. You're in a never ending loop. So I know that you have another commitment to get to. What I'd like you to maybe spend just a minute on is a couple of ideas from your TED Talks and other things, having to look at how people organize their work, their projects. Where do you start with trying to become smarter about this, trying to accomplish more? Sort of, where do you begin?
Yeah. So this is a total change of subject, but that's cool. I like changes of subject. One of the TED Talks that I gave, this is the TED Talk where I've got no hair. If you want to look out for it, and I think the title of the talk is a powerful way to improve your creativity, something like that. And the idea that I advocate is something I call slow motion multitasking. And because I noticed in my own behavior that I try to avoid multitasking. I try to avoid the kind of split screening, double screening, all of that. I don't always succeed, but I try. But what I haven't been able to avoid is juggling multiple projects. So right. I mean, this week, as I talk to you, Rita, this morning I finished the script for an interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci for the BBC. My next engagement is to interview a couple of mathematicians for a different BBC program. So that's 2 different BBC programs. I launched a book. I am very excited about this. So sorry for the name dropping, but I got an email with a message from Helena Bonham Carter, who has just been reading lines of script that I wrote for a totally different project. So I'm doing a podcast, a BBC series, a different BBC series. I spent the morning writing my Financial Times column, and I'm launching a book. And I thought, there must be something wrong with me. This is foolishness. And then I looked and I realized everybody I've ever respected, everybody who anybody has ever respected, have behaved like this. Einstein and Darwin and the great choreographer Twyla Tharp and the novelist, film writer, film director, etc., Michael Crichton. I'm not comparing myself to any of these people for a moment, but I realized this behavior may be not as dysfunctional as I fear, given that everybody who's ever achieved anything seems to engage in it. And I came up with a name for it. I called it slow motion multitasking. And in the TED Talk, I talk about why I think that this is a useful form of behavior. You get blocked on one thing, and that's not depressing or frustrating because you just move to the next project and you make progress with that. The projects cross-fertilize each other, they inform each other. And there's certain amounts of creativity can come exactly at the moment where you stop thinking about something and you start thinking about something else, and that's when the breakthrough comes. So all of these different things going on. The challenge, of course, is, and I can speak from experience, it's kind of stressful. It fries your brain. And so part of that talk is about, is there a way to get the benefits of the slow motion multitasking without completely losing your mind? I don't always succeed, but I do try.
Yeah, I know for me, and I'm absolutely in that pattern myself. For me, I try to pace it out. So sort of when one is at a very intense point, I try to have the others not require so much from me at that point.
That's the thing I should have done. That's the thing I should have done.
Just figure out who's in front of the line at this particular moment in my life. Well, what an absolute pleasure to share an hour with you. Where can people go to learn more? Presumably your programs and your website and your book site and that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah, I think the most important thing is to know how to spell my name. It is Harford, not Hartford.
My computer, by the way, I had to fix it like 6 times before it would accept my spelling. I had to put a space in between it and then delete that space.
I even misspelled my own name in a text yesterday because that's what the smartphone did.
Yeah.
So timharford.com is my website. I'm on Twitter. I'm not really on other social media, but timharford.com is where you go and see the TED Talks, you see the books, the BBC series, everything, the Financial Times columns. That's all where it is. And Rita, thank you so much. It's been such fun, really generous of you to read my book and ask all these smart questions and to present my ideas to the people who follow you. I really appreciate it.
It's really, really compelling. So for those of you who put things in the chat that we didn't get to, we follow up with you afterwards. So don't think it's a lost opportunity forever. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what your next multitasking leads to. Get the book. It's priceless. And I think it's a real tonic for a lot of what ails us right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.